Welcome to the first session in the series of Degrowth Talks, No Back to Normal. I'm Oksana, and I'll be facilitating this session together with Lorenzo. We are both members of the organizing group of the UK Degrowth Summer School. Oh, sorry. Sorry, that was the video in the background. So as many of you probably know, the summer school was supposed to take place in August this year, right before the Manchester Degrowth conference. But unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we had to make the difficult decision to postpone the summer school for now. At the same time, we realized that we can't overlook this unprecedented health and social crisis that's developing in front of our eyes, and while governments and mainstream media across the globe promising a return to normal life and totally ignoring the structural roots of the crisis, we decided that now more than ever, we need to organize and provide space for discussing truly transformative ideas and structural changes that this time calls for. That's how this series came about. And in the coming sessions, we'll be talking about how from today's normality based on destruction, exploitation, injustice, and reduction of human and non-human life to numbers, we can move to new normality based on solidarity, care, well-being, and respect for nature. Since this is the first session in the series, we would like to use it to lay the theoretical foundation for the further discussions and unpack the complexity of the term degrowth. So today we will be looking at degrowth from three perspectives: ecological economics, feminism, and the pluriverse. And to help us with this important task, we invited three incredible scholars and activists, and we are very happy to have with us today Julia Steinberger, Corinna Dengler, and Federico Demaria. And our speakers have provided some readings that we added in the description to this video. And now I'll let Lorenzo tell you about the format that we'll be following today and introduce the first speaker.
Thank you, Oksana, and hi everyone. I'm Lorenzo. I will co-moderate this talk. So today we'll follow the following format. First, we will give each speaker the chance of introducing their perspective on degrowth for up to 15 minutes each. And then we will open the discussion. So please write questions on the YouTube chat at whatever point of the talk as they come to your mind. And Oksana and I will be noting them down, trying to synthesize them, and then we'll ask them to the speakers. So please try to use the chat only for questions so that Oksana and I will have an easier job at collecting them. Now, I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, Prof. Julia Steinberger. Julia researches and teaches in the interdisciplinary areas of ecological economics and industrial ecology at the School of Earth and Environment of the University of Leeds. Her research examines the connections between resource use, like energy and materials, greenhouse gas emissions, and societal performance, like economic activity and human well-being. She's interested in quantifying the current and historical linkages between resource use and socioeconomic parameters, and identifying alternative development pathways to guide the necessary transition to a low-carbon society. She's the recipient of our Leverhulme Research Leadership Award for her research project, Living Well Within Limits, investigating how universal human well-being might be achieved within planetary boundaries. She's also lead author for the IPCC 6th Assessment Report with Working Group 3. In this talk, Julia will present degrowth from the perspective of ecological economics thought, and giving us an overview of what are the most promising directions in terms of problematizing growth and seeking alternatives. Please, Julia, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lorenzo, and thanks, Oksana, for organizing. And I'm really glad that you kept this summer school because I've been involved in quite a few alternative economic conferences where they were just like, oh, let's not do this anymore. And I think it's really important that we keep doing this. So I'm really thankful for your organization of this. So I'm going to take a lot less than 15 minutes. I'm a bit uncomfortable presenting degrowth to be the first one speaking on this because I'm a fellow traveler, but I'm not one of the core people within degrowth. But what I can tell you about is I can tell you about where I come from in ecological economics and why that has led me to come to degrowth. And I was asked to do this in a very basic way. So I'm sorry if it's too basic, it won't take long, but hopefully it's a good funnel talk to bring everybody in on the same page. And I'm just really looking forward to the discussion where we can get into what is interesting to you in more detail. So I think the first place to start is that mainstream neoclassical economics, which is the world that we live in. So it dominates our academia, but it also dominates our world. And there was this growing sense that it was not dealing at all well with environmental issues. But because neoclassical economics really puts marketization and valuation at the center, with decision-making being supposedly happening, there's sort of the story and then there's the reality, but at some level, decision-making is supposed to happen within the market, at market equilibrium. It's a very flat, sort of steady view of the world and how decisions should happen through shifting markets, slowly shifting markets. So for the environment to be included within neoclassical economics, it has to be monetized within a market. And you talk about market failures, or you talk about externalities when the environment is not included, and that is the worldview of neoclassical economics. Now, ecological economics came on the scene with people like Herman Daly and Juan Martinez Allier and others, and Kenneth Boulding, for instance, and really flipped that on its head and said that economics should not ask the environment to fit within the market, and really tried to have this revolution where the economy should fit within the environment. So instead of just monetizing stuff and expecting pollution to sort of be reduced that way, you have to think of the economy as fitting within environmental boundaries. So there's also an emphasis on environmental scale and taking the environment seriously within its own parameters. So not trying to monetize it, but trying to calculate and estimate the real quantitative parameters of our outside world, like resource flows, material flows, energy, emissions, wastes, pollution, CO2 concentrations, all of that stuff being taken at their own value and at their own, within their own sphere of reality, as opposed to having fit into the market based on a price, including biodiversity as well. And so there's been a huge amount of work and progress made on this front, with some papers that are sort of the leading papers right now that we can share with you if you want. So the methods of ecological economics are systemic, and they include things like dynamic analyses. The concept of equilibrium is not relevant anymore. We can have crises, we can have runaway exponential effects, and we can also have processes where efficiency at the process level does not lead to savings, but leads to growth in the whole system, like the rebound effect. The economy should fit within society and serve social purposes. That's another aspect of ecological economics. So there's an idea of fair distribution. But at the same time, there's still an unquestioned role of the market in terms of Herman Daly saying the market should allocate scarce resources. So once you've dealt with planetary boundaries and environmental limits, and once you've made your economy fair, then the market's still fine. It's a good place to do decision-making for all of those other not so important decisions. And that's a problem, quite honestly, because the market does not exist as an institution outside social power relations, but it's more an expression of them. It is not this sort of external fair place outside of society. So much of the challenge of ecological economics to neoclassical economics can be summarized through the green growth debate. So in this debate, neoclassical economics has given up something. It already has to agree that biophysical quantities matter on their own right. So that's sort of Greta Thunberg's point that you can't argue with physics. But in everything else, pretty much can remain unquestioned. So it's about slightly tilting the market towards green and not challenging market supremacy, not challenging growth, not challenging power structures, or to some extent even brown industries. You're not supposed to name the fossil fuel industries. They're supposed to go gently into that good night of market equilibrium, slightly less profitable industries. Slight problem with green growth is that there's no empirical evidence for green growth, right? There is just no such thing. So you can see reviews by Jorgos Kallis and Jason Hickel recently. There was an amazing article by Iago Otero showing that growth and biodiversity loss travel very much together. So we have core problems with this green growth paradigm, which is sort of where ecological economics and neoclassical economics can interact in a nice way. Once you move away from that debate, we're leaving neoclassical economics far behind, and actually quite a bit of ecological economics who would quite like green growth to be something that we can still discuss politely. So that's when we go into the realm of degrowth. So degrowth goes further than so it's part of ecological economics, but also goes much further than ecological economics in three core ways, in my view. So the first of these is that it sets out full frontally to challenge growth supremacy. So this is not about beyond growth, it's not about post growth, it's not about a growth. I mean, all of these things can be friendly, right? They can be allied, but this degrowth is about a central challenge to the growth paradigm and to the idea that growth is a beneficial, reasonable goal for economies to pursue. So it's really sort of heading for the target of growth-based economies and saying and challenging the sort of central god of our times in that way. So in that sense, it's much more confrontational and much more direct as a mission. So one of the reasons this is really important is because in a growth-centric society, growth is viewed as a proxy for everything good. As long as we have growth, eventually we will have poverty alleviation. Eventually we will maybe have inequality reduction. Eventually we will have green progress and innovation and investments. And it's only through growth, according to this ideology, that we can have the good things we rely on to live, like a welfare state, like a functioning government, like social support or education or healthcare or old age pensions. So everything good in life comes from growth. And when you talk about degrowth, you're really saying, actually, we have to question that. We have to question these links that exist in our culture and in our society. And so degrowth challenges each of these assumed links and counters the claim that it's not possible to have good things without growth. And that means that it opens up all these new areas of research, and some of my research is directly on these kinds of topics, like, does growth actually contribute to well-being? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Shall we check? And in a growth ideology, you're not supposed to do that. You're just supposed to take it as given. And of course, when you start checking it, you find out that growth does not, in fact, contribute to well-being, to greening the economy, to any of these things. So that's interesting. The second aspect of degrowth that I think is really important is that it includes many other schools of thought. So it welcomes them in and relies on them much more than ecological economics does. So engages much more fully with social sciences beyond economics, like sociology, anthropology, psychology, history, aspects of culture as well. So it gives us a much more rich understanding of the role of the economy and growth in society, and how the economy interacts with daily life and with communities, with production, consumption, labor, personal relations, and so on, and how daily life can change. So it's basically, in terms of degrowth, because it engages much more fully with all these different aspects of social sciences, one of the things it acknowledges is that changing growth and changing the economy is going to change society, is going to change how we interact, is going to change how we work, how our families function, how we interact with our cities, with our supply chains. All of this stuff is going to have to change. And so in some ways, it really takes to heart the idea that the economy is within society and not separate from it. The third way that degrowth, I would say, is different, distinguishes itself from ecological economics, is that it has an emphasis on social movements and activism, so academic activism as well as imaginaries. And we're going to hear more about this as well during the course of the summer school and today. So it's this idea of a paradigm shift that involves actively overthrowing the previous one. So you're not just trying to politely in an academic debate convince the other side, you're saying, no, we're actually part of a movement and we are going to target your paradigm, develop a new one, and have activism to support it. And we're going to describe and enact alternatives around it. So that's quite important as well. So all of these things I think are important and really positive about degrowth. I would, and it's a very diverse community, and I'm probably not representing quite a bit of it fairly. I would have one or two elements of critique of degrowth. So I just want to list those to sort of open up the questions about it as well. So for me, growth is not just a paradigm and a goal. It's an assemblage of core structures that reinforce power and wealth accumulation, which effectively you could describe as capitalism. And if we are serious about doing systems analysis, we have to focus on these structures rather than the story they use to perpetuate themselves. So this idea of the growth is the good story, we have to challenge it, but we also have to challenge what growth is doing for powerful entities within our societies. And we have to look at those connections and we have to target those. So not just the story they tell about themselves, but also the reality that they're enacting in our world. So this means, in my view, a more systemic exploration of the political economy of resource use, of profits, of where profits come from in terms of extractivism from the environment, and extractivism, colonization, exploitation, and oppression in society. And I think that this needs to be done along supply chains, and it needs to be done using heterodox economic approaches like systems of provision. And an example of that is a paper we just published earlier in the last few weeks on car dependency, which I'm happy to share as well. So the other thing is, if we are in a power struggle, we need to focus much more on organizing and mobilizing and building coalitions and all this sort of dirty work of building a very strong social movement with a very strong adversary, right? This is not to be underestimated. And I think that this is something that we need to take seriously within the degrowth community as well. So we're going up against the fossil fuel industry, we're going up against financialization. We need to understand who we work with to do that. It's not just about the idea of growth, it's about fighting specific actors who benefit from growth and really rely on it. And I will leave it there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. And our second speaker is Karina Dangler. She's a feminist ecological economist and a degrowth scholar activist. She's a research assistant at the Department for Economics and Ethics at the University of Vechta in Germany, and has recently submitted her PhD thesis titled Feminist Futures, What Degrowth Learns from the Feminist Critique of Science, Economics and Growth. Corinna is also a founding member of the Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance and is part of its coordinating group. So Corinna will tell us about the feminist perspective on degrowth, and will also tell us about the work of FADA. Corinna, please.
Yes. Hey. So first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation and the introduction, Oksana, and also Lorenzo. It's really great that the series is going on. So Julia has just now introduced more an ecological economics perspective to degrowth, and indeed I think that the ecological growth critique is kind of the most articulate one on the degrowth discourse. However, there are also other growth critiques which explicitly or in a more implicit manner feed into the degrowth discourse. And one of those growth critiques is a feminist critique also of science, of economics, and of growth, which I want to talk about today. So as you said, Oksana, I'm a feminist ecological economist. I don't know how many of you have heard about feminist economics before, at least here in Germany or in Austria, where I studied socio-ecological economics. It's not exactly a standard course in socio-economics curricula. So just to give a brief summary, feminist economics has its roots in first wave feminism in the end of the 19th century. However, that it systematically developed as a heterodox economic school of thought. It was roughly in the 1970s and then was institutionalized in 1992 with the foundation of the International Association of Feminist Economics, of IFE. So feminist economics, there's a lot of different approaches to it. And maybe one could summarize it by saying that feminist economics aims at unmasking gender norms and also androcentrism in both economic theory and in economic policies. And it does so by making gender injustice visible and also by trying to overcome them. So as feminist economists line out, like many of these gender injustices are inseparably linked to the gender division of labor and the long-standing socio-cultural attribution, which sees women as primarily responsible for unpaid care work, such as, I don't know, raising children, doing housework, caring for the elderly. There's loads of empirical evidence, and I think now in times of COVID-19, this becomes also clearer, that also most women have long entered wage work, and their second shift, as it's called in feminist economics, they are still in charge of most unpaid care work. So there's things that degrowth can learn from feminist economics critique, like, for example, the feminist critique of GDP, the narrow concept of work, or the critique of the Homo economicus. However, as I mentioned earlier, feminist economics is an umbrella term for a variety of approaches, and not all of them are equally compatible with degrowth. So what I want to suggest is that in degrowth scholarship and activism, we should really focus on the growth critical parts of feminist economics, which are mostly to be found in feminist ecological economics. For me personally, and maybe that's also a literature recommendation for some of you, the 1997 Ecological Economics special issue titled Women, Ecology and Economics, edited by feminist ecological economist and also FADA member Ellie Perkins, has been very formative. But as we will hear later on, there are also other strands of feminist academic engagement with the environment from which we can learn. But to give just a really brief overview of what feminist degrowth is about, there's really a lot I could talk about this, but I decided to stick to kind of 3 core messages. So my first message today is that feminism is not an add-on. Stating that as degrowth scholars and activists, we're interested in emancipatory and in systemic alternatives. So of course, we're also feminists. That's simply not good enough. Patriarchy is a system older than capitalism, and gender relations are really omnipresent. We're producing and reproducing those unequal gender relations on a daily basis, and more often than not, putatively gender neutral policies have highly gendered outcomes. So gender relations are a cross-cutting theme, and as degrowth scholars and activists, we have to kind of sensitize ourselves to the circumstance. But what does this mean more concretely? I'm just going to give 2 brief examples. So with my colleague and good friend Birti Strunk, we have analyzed, for example, the work sharing proposal, the degrowth work sharing proposal Friday Off, which aims for shorter working weeks. And what we were saying is that if we really took feminist concerns into account from the very beginning, and also the fact that most caring activities occur on a daily basis, this would lead us to the conclusion that the work sharing proposal, which focuses on shorter working days instead of shorter working weeks, is more feminist, and as recent studies, which I can also share, have shown, not necessarily less ecological. Moreover, and that's more a thing about semantics, but it's still important, in the degrowth discourse, from a feminist ecological economics perspective, we should be careful not to reproduce this work equals wage work narrative, which kind of invisibilizes all other forms of socially vital work, such as, for example, unpaid care work, subsistence work, community work, or our political work in activist groups. It's simply not true to state that if people spend less hours in wage work, it means more free time for everybody, because if we aimed at a gender just distribution of paid and unpaid work, there's quite a bit of extra workload for some of us. So if we aim at breaking this narrative from what is proper work and non-work, as feminist economics urges us to, we should also watch our semantics and not fall into this trap of equalizing those 2 things. So as I kind of said, feminist economics, feminist degrowth aims at a gender just distribution of both paid and unpaid care work. I'm convinced that degrowth does offer an opportunity for such challenging tasks that feminists have been taking on for, I don't know, at least half a century. However, and I think that's the main takeaway from this first message, a window of opportunity is by no means an automatism. Rather, whether our degrowth imaginary is also gender just, or if it unintentionally reproduces gender injustice, crucially depends on how organized and how articulate feminist positions are within our degrowth discourse. The second message today is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel for making degrowth more feminist. The feminist critique of economics and the feminist critique of growth is much older than the degrowth discourse itself, and there has been plenty written on it. Also, more surprising it was to me actually, when I started to endorse degrowth first activism and scholarship like 6 or 7 years back, that degrowth only seemed to have founding fathers like ecological economists and the founding fathers of degrowth. So I remember asking myself, how about the founding mothers actually, and how does the feminist critique of science, of economics, and of growth play into degrowth? What mechanisms of exclusion are in play when these contributions are structurally forgotten? And how can we disrupt and overcome these mechanisms? Or how can we actually queer this whole binary founding mother, founding father altogether? So I don't really have the time to talk about this a lot because it's really an extensive field of knowledge, but I'll try to briefly give some sparks on what degrowth can, should, and must learn from feminist academic engagement with the environment. So I have briefly mentioned feminist ecological economics before, but there's much more content really, and it's much more diverse. So if we start as early as with Rosa Luxemburg's 1913 book, The Accumulation of Capital, Luxemburg stresses that a non-capitalist outside is an indispensable prerequisite for capital accumulation and growth. So ever since then, there has been strands of feminist academic engagement with the environment, which more or less explicitly draw on this basic insight. In this regard, degrowth scholarship can fruitfully draw upon, to name just a few of those strands, materialist ecofeminism, the subsistence approach, feminist ecological economics, post-colonial approaches to feminism and the environment, or feminist political ecology, all of which hold valuable insights for us. One of the core insights from this school of thought is that in a capitalist system, there is a structural similarity when it comes to the devaluation of female-coded reproductive labor on the one hand, and the destruction of nature on the other hand. Let me use a picture I drew just before to clarify what I mean. I hope you see it the right way around. So you can see a triangle here. Like on the top of this triangle, there is the monetized economy, or as Maria Mies would say, the tip of the iceberg. It's at the top of the triangle, and that's not by accident. The sphere of production includes all the things, all the services included in GDP and national accounts. However, the much bigger part of the triangle is underwater. This bottom part of the triangle, I call it the sphere or the economy of socio-ecological provisioning here. It includes both social and ecological reproduction. Social reproduction here, we have talked about it before. It's also unpaid care work, the lion's share of which is still done by women. Ecological production, on the other hand, it's also ecosystem functions, which, like, the notion of ecosystem function is quite different from the anthropocentric notion of ecosystem services. So it's really the unpaid ecosystem functions. So going back to what we heard from Rosa Luxemburg before, it's the basis of this triangle, which is a prerequisite for every production process in the monetized economy. However, at the same time, this very basis is invisibilized, exploited, devalued in the case of unpaid care work, and destroyed in the case of ecosystem functions and nature. So one of the core insights from feminist degrowth or feminist ecological economics is that we need to overcome this boundary here in the middle. It's a deep structure of separation between the spheres of production and the sphere of reproduction. And yeah, we have to overcome this boundary somehow without just moving everything up by monetizing everything, like making every ecosystem function an ecosystem service or every unpaid care work paid care work. So I don't really have time to go into more detail, but I hope you got an idea of what I meant. And I think the main takeaway from the second message is that we have to counteract that by being socialized in a patriarchal system, we keep structurally forgetting what feminists have already pointed out a long time ago. As degrowth scholars and activists, we should embrace these often neglected roots of critical environmental thinking. We should check our degrowth introductory course syllabi. Is feminist critique of economics and growth there? If not, change it. You can read Maria Mee's groundbreaking book, Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, or reread the Wages for Housework campaign from the 1970s, or take a humble look at how care is organized in societies that haven't had the historical privilege of a welfare state. And this really great recent edited volume towards a political economy of degrowth, Katia Gregorati and Ria Raphael summarize this more beautifully than I could as follows. I'm quoting from the book now. What may be needed, we contend, is not to recast existing intellectual histories by steering feminists in, but to critically engage with this early scholarship, appreciating its historical significance and unique contributions to contemporary degrowth debates. My third and short last message today is that you should check out the network Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance. Oksana has already triggered this one. The network, FADA as we call it, is a network within the degrowth community, which was founded at the 2016 5th International Degrowth Conference in Budapest. And as an international and inclusive network of academics, activists, and scholar activists, it aims at making feminist thought and practice an integral part of degrowth. The network mainly operates in form of a mailing list for many discussions and project ideas, but there is also a coordination group, which, for example, organizes FADA sessions at international degrowth conferences. As some of you might have already seen before, last week, we have published both a one-pager and a longer statement called Collaborative Feminist Degrowth, Pandemic as an Opening for a Careful Radical Transformation on degrowth.info, which is currently, like the one-pager, I can also show it, it's currently being translated, It's currently being translated in different languages. So my dear friend and colleague Anna Save initiated this process, and after her kickoff via the FADA mailing list, it's really been a very beautiful and collaborative thinking and writing effort from around 40 scholars and activists affiliated with FADA. I believe we're going to talk about the content of the manifesto and the pandemic afterwards, so I don't want to anticipate anything. But for now, let me close this introduction just by saying that although ecological concerns have more weight than gender justice concerns in degrowth scholarship, I really see this formation and ongoing activities in the Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance as really a hope for feminist degrowth futures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corinna. I'm now honored to introduce our third and last speaker, Federico Demaria. Federico is an interdisciplinary socio-environmental scientist, currently working as a lecturer in ecological economics and political ecology at the University of Barcelona. He is the co-editor of 3 books, Degrowth, A Vocabulary for a New Era from 2015, that translated it into 10 languages, and Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary from last year, and also the forthcoming book, The Case for Degrowth. He's a founding member of Research and Degrowth, and his research focuses on first how natural resources and environmental impacts are unequally distributed, and second on how to move towards more socially just and ecologically sustainable worlds. Federico will now give us his perspective on degrowth, complementing what has been said so far, and in addition, he will situate degrowth within the broader framework of the Pluriverse. I leave it to you, Federico.
Yeah. thanks Lorenzo, Oksana, and all the team who organized these degrowth talks. And I want to say also thanks to my partner who's taking care of our son so that I can be with you, just to visualize a little bit of care work. Today I would like to focus a little bit on the issue of how do we get out of this mess. And one of the main, well, one question I'll ask is, what are you planning to do to react to this? And one of my main arguments is that I think we should be focusing on the alliance between environmentalists and feminists. And this is something that has been emerging already from the intervention of Julie and Corinna. So let me first start with the pluriverse and then say something on degrowth. Now, we are currently facing somehow of a collapse of the economy. So there is a mainstream proposal on the table, which is to relaunch the economy, to relaunch growth, because we know, as Julie said, that growth is like a panacea. It can solve any problem. While looking at this situation, I think what we have to keep in mind is that we are not only facing an economic crisis or a sanitary crisis, but there is a multidimensional crisis. There are inequalities that are raising, there are gender inequalities, there is climate change, so forth, etc. So what we have to keep in mind is that our response should be trying to tackle all these crises together. There is a version of the response to the crisis that is on the table of mainstream debates also. There is a kind of a green version of the relaunch of the economy along the lines of green growth and Green New Deal. So here exactly our argument is, and my argument right now is that we should be discussing other options in response to the crisis. That degrowth is one of these options that is on the table, but that there is not only one response, but that there are many responses. And this is really the idea of the pluriverse, the idea that there is not a single universe, a single way of looking at the situation and only way of responding to it, but there are many, not only in theory, or they're not only utopias, but they are already there and we need to give visibility to them. So if we have to discuss what is wrong with the mainstream responses to the crisis, some has already been said by the former speakers, but basically the mainstream response is heavily based on debt. In fact, economic growth is normally fueled with debt. In fact, before the pandemic, we were already at record high levels of debt around the world, if you sum public debt and private debt. So the spending that the investments that they are proposing is going to increase this debt. One thing that you could do instead of increasing debt is clearly redistributing wealth, for instance. But again, here the problem is not only to do with economic issues like employment or inequalities. It has to do with gender, as Corinna argued. It has to do with ecology, as Julie argued. And then I could add one more argument to it. That is, if you want a more of an anthropological or cultural perspective. And this is, it comes from a tradition of cultural critiques to development. Development as a concept, economic development, is a very recent one, which came after the Second World War. But in the end is an imposition of a Western perspective upon the rest of the world. And we know what development is the idea that we should be producing and consuming more. So there is this idea of linear progress, which can be measured, for instance, by GDP with economic growth. So the cultural critique to it, which has been done since the 70s, at least in this current of thought, which is called post-development, if you want, by people like Arturo Escobar and many other, including feminists, is this idea that, that this is obviously wrong because you have contexts that are clearly different, because they are different historically, politically, economically, cultural, so on and so forth. So the idea that you have one single way among all the people of the world is a little bit strange. So what we did in our book, Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary that you can find online, and you can download also all of the publication I mentioned and the books also from my academia.edu account. What we did in this book, it was a collection of alternatives around the world. So we are 5 different editors from different continents around the world, and we were looking at what social movements are proposing around the world. So there are experiences that are already working in the different continents, and you see the different aspects that are emerging from the different alternatives. So here the idea is really that degrowth is one of these alternatives, but it is not the only one. Now, I can also identify a few challenges with this idea of the pluriverse. So the first one is a long debate that comes, for example, from the experience, the clashes, if you want, between Marxists and anarchists of this idea of bottom-up versus top-down or centralization. And this is coming back with the current pandemic, because we are seeing states centralizing the decision-making power and imposing upon large territories very strict measures and so on. So, of course, the perspective of the pluriverse is more focused on the bottom-up experiences. So, local experiences and also network of experiences that are emerging. Of course, there are limits to them and to the authority, because they will always face a kind of some obstacles, because at some points they will face larger authorities, for instance, the state. So there is the first challenge. The second challenge is that the idea that we should support pluriversality is not so obvious. And there is a very strong case for universality, for the idea that there are universal values, and for example, human rights. We know that human rights are problematic because, for instance, they defend property rights, which are at the base of capitalism and so on. But pluriversality can easily follow into some kind of cultural relativism, in which we say that everything is acceptable, and that is obviously problematic. In the Pluriverse book, in which we basically do 3 things. There are 3 sections in the book. The first section is a critique of development from the different continents of the world. For example, there is Vandana Shiva for Asia and so on. In the second section, we are making a critique of mainstream proposals like green growth, sustainable development, climate smart agriculture, geoengineering, so on and so forth. But really the core of the book is really the first section, which is about 100 alternatives from the world. Some of them you will know, like eco-socialism or ecofeminism or buen vivir, Ubuntu, and so on and so forth. But many you will never heard them, and I cannot even pronounce them myself. So I can assure you they will be new. In the introduction of the book, in which we try to introduce this idea of the pluriverse, we also try to set, if you want, to outline a series of ethical principles that we find somehow that they are common among all these alternatives. And this comes from an experience of convergence of alternatives from India, an experience that is called Bikram Salgam, because one of the questions on the table, as I think clearly Julie said, is how do we build a convergence among different movements and different perspectives. Now, when we identify a set of universal, if you want, ethical principles, then we are entering into a contradiction with the perspective that we are proposing of the pluriverse. So here again, there is clearly a tension that I think needs to be discussed. And third, and related to the second one, there is the issue of if we say, as the Zapatista in Mexico in Chiapas say, that the pluriverse is a world where many words fit, then what do we do with those words that are imperializing, that they want to dominate other words? And these, I'm clearly thinking of, if you want, the ethno-nationalists, extreme right wing, so on and so forth. So what place do they have within the pluriverse? If we identify a set of ethical principles, then we can say, if you want, who is in and who is out of the pluriverse that we envision. But then we face that problem of the debate between universality and pluriversality. I'm sorry if I'm making this complicated, but I also want to say that there are complexities and there are sanctions, and that not everything is solved. Now, in my experience, and linking to the second part of my intervention, if you want, I've been giving quite a few talks on degrowth, and one of the common questions is really, what about the global south? The idea is that degrowth emerges out of so-called developed nation, and it is fought for them. So we are not proposing degrowth as an alternative to sustainable development. So in the sense that it would apply for all over the world, we are discussing degrowth, and we have in mind Europe and the so-called developed countries. And we want to enter into a dialogue with other experiences around the world. Of course, there are similarities, commonalities, and differences with these other experiences, and those we should be discussing. Just to give a brief history of degrowth, degrowth comes as an activist slogan at the beginning of the year 2000. So it's not an idea that comes, if you want, from intellectuals and academia. Of course, it has all the roots. For instance, in the 70s on the limits to growth debate. It was back in the 70s when André Gorz, the French political ecologist, used for the first time the word degrowth. But it's really not until the year 2000 that this is launched by grassroots activists in France as a slogan, as an horizon for a more general movement. Here, there is a long, not a very long, I mean, 15 years or 20 years history of degrowth that you can read it in, for instance, in the degrowth vocabulary. But basically the idea is that the activists were looking for a more radical proposal, and not only for a critique. This is important. We have to make a critique, but we have to make proposal also. We need our own narratives. This degrowth, especially from the year 2008, we translated it into English. We started to organize biennial conferences, and then it really entered the academic debate. There are now 500 published papers. There are maybe 10 books. We have a master in political ecology, degrowth, and environmental justice in Barcelona. So if you want, it has become institutionalized into academia, as Corinna was saying, that feminist economics became institutionalized also. There is still a long way to go, and I hope you will be part of it. Of course, we could ask the question, why degrowth? And as Julie said, there are ecological concerns, but not only. There are social concerns. There are concerns about the meaning of life, for instance, and there is a clear link with spirituality. There is a connection with what I was saying before of the cultural critiques to development, and this idea of the social imaginary, of what we could call the social representation. What do we think that is important in life? Getting a job, buying a house, having a dog, a car, and etc. Or if we want to challenge that idea, how do we envision a good life? And I think a lot of work has been done on the why degrowth questions. So on this idea of giving reasons of why we are challenging the centrality of economic growth in our societies. I think where we are now, it's really on the question of how. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Who is going to do it? And for whom? For instance, it's not by chance that the degrowth conference, the international degrowth conference that comes at the end of these degrowth talks in Vienna is clearly focused on strategies. And obviously this is very important. So this is why I was asking at the beginning of my talk, how are we responding to this crisis? And specifically, what are you, if you want, planning to do in response to this? I could say, I think that, as Julie said, the degrowth community is really diverse. And I could maybe say that on the why degrowth question, there is a kind of shared understanding. Different people might put different emphasis on the different aspects, as Corinna did on the gender aspect and Julie did on the ecological aspect. But I would say, maybe it's too ambitious, but everyone is more or less aware of the different aspects. Now, I think where the controversies and the stronger debates are exactly on the question of how. And here, again, there is a reproduction of historical debates in political movements, as the ones I mentioned before, between those who would support more bottom-up initiatives and those who would be more in favor of top-down, for instance, state policies, and so on and so forth. There is a very lively debate. At the Degrowth conferences, there are not only academic conferences, there are places where activists, scholars, artists, journalists, students, and all broad of actors really meet. And one of the core objectives is clearly that we bring them together into a dialogue. I would say that each of us is contributing in the way we can, and with the things we enjoy and we know how to do. We published in 2014 a book that is called Degrowth, a Vocabulary for a New Era, that is trying to show how degrowth in itself is diverse. So we present degrowth as a vocabulary. We invited activists and scholars to present 50 different concepts that are central in debates around degrowth, so that we clarify the language we are using. If we want to envision a new world, we need new language also, because we know, as the situationists used to say, that language is really the house of power. In the introduction to it, we use all these words to define degrowth. Now, we are about now to release a new book, which is called The Case for Degrowth, with Yorgos Kallis, Giacomo Dalis, and Susal Ponsos, in which we are trying to focus on this issue of strategies. So I'll give a few ideas from there, and then we can go on with the debate. So in this book, we are trying, if you want, to make a synthesis between these different perspectives of bottom-up and top-down. So we are using the example of Barcelona, of the city where three of us live. Susan lives in Florida, which has been experiences after the financial crisis. There were elections, and then this coalition of left-wing parties and political movements won the municipality council, and they are now ruling, and they're doing very interesting stuff. And what we are seeing is that there is a nice convergence of what has been doing from the grassroots level, for example, in terms of solidarity economy, feminist group, environmentalist, etc., and how this is being institutionalized through policies at the municipal level. So there is a kind of positive feedback between the two, between the grassroots and between the policy level. Of course, there are problems because the municipalities have a limited competence, so they cannot decide on a basic income, for instance, but this is interesting. So this is a little bit on this idea we are building up on the book, saying that it's very important to look at grassroots initiatives because they are like experiments. They are creating new experiences, they are testing them, they're creating also new culture. And then we are discussing how this can be reinforced by policies from the state. So we are discussing ideas that are very common in degrowth, and there are proposals that we have been putting on the table for a while. If you want, you can look at the article we published that is called Yes, We Can Prosper Without Growth, that lists 10 policies that could be implemented in order to reorient the economy towards one that functions without growth. In fact, I think if I can add one dimension, we always argue against growth, but I think the current scenario of collapse of the economy gives us one more argument, if you want, that since your economy is anyway collapsed, then there is, even if you think that economic growth would be good, then it's still, I think it still has legitimacy to think of how can we manage an economy without growth, because the idea of relaunching the growth will not necessarily work. In fact, austerity policy aimed to relaunch growth, but they sacrificed everything. So the proposal here is, how can we implement policies that do not sacrifice everything in order to relaunch growth, hoping that then growth will solve the problems that we have? Why don't we focus exactly on the problems that we have now? So the policies would be like the reduction of working hours, work sharing, redistribution of income and wealth. And then there is this idea of the basic income. In the book, we are supporting this idea of, instead of calling it universal basic income, of calling it universal care income. If we want to take seriously what Corinna was saying, and the idea that we want to put care, to put life at the center of our society, as the feminists are proposing, then one idea would be to recognize that care work that is unpaid and normally gendered, in the sense that it's mainly done by women, to simplify. Then if we give a universal income, why don't we call it a universal care income, in the sense that we are recognizing that there is a lot of work that is done in order to sustain life, and therefore the state would pay an income, for example, of 500, 600 euro to every citizens in order to support this. In fact, the sanitary crisis we are living is putting at the center the importance of care work, for instance, because of the hospitals and so on, but also of what is going on within households. I think I've talked too much like usual. Let me just conclude and say that on the questions of how do we move forward, for instance, how do we move forward from these degrowth talks, instead of just meeting and discussing nice ideas and then drinking beers with our friends home, if you have any at your home, then what can we do? I saw people in the chat in the YouTube channel right now saying, oh, is there anyone in Switzerland? That's a good thing, because we need to get organized. And I think that's very important. I think if I look at the experience of Spain, one option on the table would really be to work consistently on an alliance between the environmental and the feminist. In Spain, the most important social movement right now is clearly the feminist movement. It is the one who can mobilize the largest number of people. With the strikes on the 8th of March, they were really able to bring to the streets millions of people. And the other movement which we saw had a lot of strength was the movement for climate justice. So why don't we think how we could bring these two together? Why don't we join the feminist group in your village and raise up the issue of climate change, for instance? Or why don't you do the reverse? I really think, in fact, that the feminist movement has a great potential. Not all the there are many feminists we know, and not all of them would be so sensitive to the issue of ecology. But I think the theoretical perspective that they have is much more open than others in order to understand the importance of care and on ecology and so on. So I think there is really a potential. I see a kind of an inflation of manifestos lately. I think I sign one per week, or sometimes one per day. I don't even read them anymore. I think some of them are really important, like the one from FADA, from the Feminist and Degrowth Alliance, for what it says, because it's saying something new. But I think we have to think how we move forward from manifestos. I was part of a manifesto which we published 2 years ago, signed by more than 200 scientists in Europe, including Corinna and Julie, I guess. And then we launched it as a petition, and it was signed by almost 100,000 people. And that's nice. It gives visibility to our movement, and it gives legitimacy also to it. But then we have to ask the question, what after? And I think this is a question I would like to debate with you, but I'm open. Thank you very much, and sorry for being too long.
Oh, that was great, Federico. Thank you very much. So we're going to move to the discussion, and we encourage the viewers to type more questions in the chat. And the first question that we would like to ask is about the elephant in the room, the pandemic. And as we all know, there's been an article titled "The Coronavirus Crisis Reveals the Misery of Degrowth." And similar statements were made by other commentators, and degrowth activists countered this claim, arguing that what is happening now is not degrowth. Could each of you elaborate why what is happening now, this slowdown, is not the degrowth that we're trying to create? Julia, would you like to go first?
Yeah, well, I think it's very easy to counter this, and so I wrote a piece. If people are interested, they can read it. It's linked in the YouTube on Pandenomics. But I think the point is that this crisis, the pandemic turning the economy into sort of pale shadow its former self, and putting a lot of people's livelihoods and well-being and health obviously in danger, is actually an evidence of a growth crisis. So it's because our economies are entirely dependent on growth and sort of fall apart when that growth isn't sustained even for a couple of months to protect ourselves, that we have the economic crisis accompanying a health crisis. And degrowth actually has a lot of proposals that would very sensibly protect us against that kind of danger. And I think we should really take that up. And we should welcome that challenge. If people start talking about it, it's because they're afraid. And yes, maybe the petitions don't do so much, but there is definitely traction in this concept, and a lot of people in sort of higher places saying, oh, you can't talk about it now. And it's like, oh no, we're going to talk about it now. We need to talk about it right now. So I think that that's also something to bear in mind and be encouraged by, actually.
Karina, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Julia has said. And it's not a new statement, right? Like already in the last crisis, people told us, oh, and that's your degrowth now. And we were like, no, this recession is not our degrowth. And it's the same. We have to reiterate this and say the pandemic slowdown now is not our degrowth. And basically, there's this other slogan about saying that degrowth by design or by disaster. And what we're always saying is that we're trying to have degrowth by design, a voluntary bottom-up and bottom-linked socio-ecological transformation. And I think the crisis now is a pandemic slowdown. It's both. It's a risk, and it's really fucked up. Also from a feminist perspective, there are so many things like domestic violence is increasing. You can see that all governments around the world are kind of outsourcing the heavy burden of securing public health to the shoulders of care workers, which are mostly women, both in paid and unpaid care work. So it's really nothing a feminist degrowth imaginary would ever want, but we could still now think about how we could, and like already right now, and then in the aftermath of the pandemic, create something like a careful degrowth transformation to a better world afterwards. Yeah.
Federico, are you there?
Sorry, I got distracted with the YouTube chat. Now, 2 points on this. So the first one is, well, there is a common critique to degrowth, that degrowth is not a nice slogan because it's negatives and it will put people away. No, so degrowth is trying as a slogan. It wants to be provocative, and it wants to annoy people if you want to challenge the social imaginary, the idea that growth is positive for anything and so on and so forward. Then when we launch the slogan degrowth, then it's provocative, and in our opinion it worked. Now, degrowth also cannot be easily co-opted because nobody will use such a bad word. No, it is a little bit what happened with fear, that used to be an insult, and then it has been recuperated by the activists themselves. Now, the degrowth question, and this is my second point, is exactly, it has been putting on the table how to manage the economy without growth. What is striking is that economists had never been thinking on how to manage an economy without growth. And this is what we have been saying on macroeconomics, and with this new idea of ecological macroeconomics. So there is an article, a recent article in Nature Sustainability, and when I was getting distracting, I was trying to post it on the chat that you can look, that is called Feasible Alternatives to Green Growth. And there they are testing different scenarios for both the effects on inequalities and climate change of different policies. And what we see is that the degrowth scenarios is the one that would do best in terms of inequalities and climate change. So the question is that really degrowth has been trying to provide an alternative and is a viable option right now, much more, I think, than this crazy idea of focusing on growth and sacrificing everything in order to relaunch growth. In the end, the pandemic is putting on the table the conflict between capital and life. So the question is, what do you choose, life or capital?
Well, thank you, Federico. As you ended on this note about capital, I'll bring up the first question we had in the chat today, which was the difference between, well, if degrowth is compatible with any aspect of capitalism. So when we're speaking about degrowth, are we talking of anti-capitalism, full anti-capitalism? Are we not? I think Julia probably made clear that we should tackle the more structural capitalist roots, and that in this way, perhaps degrowth is not enough as a framework, or degrowth, is it itself actually anti-capitalist? I don't know who wants to answer this question. Julia or Federico or Corinna?
I already answered it from my perspective. So for me, degrowth has to be anti-capitalist because you can't, capitalism is the stabilization mechanism of capitalism. So if you understand it from that perspective, it kind of has to be, but I'll let Federico and Karina.
Yeah, I can go next. So yes, I would totally agree with Julia. I mean, there are different approaches to degrowth, and I think in Germany for a long time there was this trend which was more about sufficiency and a bit more about what you as individuals can do, which is why I, from the very beginning, like very much the French and Barcelona and Southern European debate, which was from the very beginning very much anti-capitalist. So I think there are different understandings, and as Federico said before, it's also a strength that we're having this umbrella term, which also people who are not thinking so much on structural level can kind of still participate. But for me personally, also degrowth is very decidedly anti-capitalist.
Well, the difficult issue here is what is capitalism. If you want to say, I was very happy, you know, when I came, I'm from Italy, when I came to Barcelona, you would go to the demonstration and then I'm anti-capitalist was a common slogan and I liked it, but I always wonder, I don't know what they mean. I think degrowth, for instance, challenged the basic institution of capitalism. Private property with the idea of commons and even squatting and so on. It challenges wage labor, if you want, when we are proposing a universal care income, if you want. We are trying to break with this idea that you have to work in order to get a salary in order to make a livelihood. This is a very recent idea in the history of humankind, so I think it can easily be challenged, and so on and so forth. We could say, for instance, that there was a survey at the Degrowth conference in 2014 in Leipzig, and the authors, Dennis Evansberg and Matthias Meltzer, they were trying to make some clusters of what are the main groups within the degrowth community. And the anti-capitalist one, I think, was the largest one. So we could say that generally speaking, yes, degrowth challenges capitalism. Then we could also discuss, because this is a common critique from the Marxist perspective, why do we put so much emphasis on economic growth and not on capitalism in itself? Well, we could discuss it. It's a long debate, but clearly economic growth serves an important function within capitalism. The first one, if you want, is ideological in the sense that you say that you don't need redistribution because there is economic growth and therefore there will be trickle down and there will be enough for everyone. Same for environmental issues. You say, no, you don't need to reduce production and consumption because your production can be more efficient with technologies, improvement in efficiency, so on and so forth. And therefore, again, you are not questioning economic growth. Economic growth, I remember once when I gave a talk in China, one student raised his hand and he said, well, when you are talking about economic growth, you are talking about capital accumulation. I said, yes, in Marxist terms, that is how you could refer to it. So yes, I would say, broadly speaking, degrowth questions capitalism. Is not at all an easy debate. We do engage with these questions in our degrowth vocabulary, if you want, and there are many other authors that engage with it from different perspectives, and you can have a look if you're interested.
Another question coming from the chat, one of the recent ones. How should degrowth activists handle popular ideas and environmental movements about green growth and overpopulation? How do you seek common ground without ceding the basis? Particularly relating to the topic of overpopulation, given that it's becoming quite popular in the context of the pandemic. Karina, would you like to go first about this?
Well, I can try. Yeah, so overpopulation discourse, it's something, there's always this one person at Ecological Economics conferences who asks about the overpopulation. I myself find it a super difficult debate because it is mostly racist, and I don't think degrowth should engage in overpopulation debates because there's a lot of empirical evidence which clearly shows that it's about, like, we're having a distribution conflict, distribution of wealth, distribution of income, and not a conflict of overpopulation. With that.
Julia and Federico, would you like to add anything?
And in terms, I like the way the question was asked, which is how do we make common ground? So do we need to make common ground? And I think we should try to make common ground. I think with people who put forward these sort of alternative views of the world, that the problem is not with the economy. We can live with economic growth. We can have green growth. The problem is with, people, too many people. And I think that the way, if you want to build common ground, one of the ways to do it is, this is something that happens with climate and climate denial and all these other sort of discourses, is that you have to invite people to come over and be on the ground of what Karina was saying, which is empirical evidence, and say, okay, well, let's look at the evidence. What are the environmental burdens associated with, different types of population? What is the empirical evidence for green growth and its claims for being possible? And if these people are open to that discussion, they will sort of naturally get corralled into understanding that degrowth has to be on the table and degrowth should be a reasonable option to discuss, because there is no empirical evidence or very anecdotal and empirical evidence for the other side. So I think that that's one way to do it. If they refuse to engage with the empirical evidence, then you don't need to just continue a discussion in good faith, because you can just say, I'm going to stand over here with reality, and I'll let you continue on your way. But I don't have a duty to waste my time talking to somebody who does not engage with reality. And that's also where I draw the line with climate denial, which happens a lot.
I think Julie is pointing to an interesting debate, no, on this idea of should we engage with rational arguments, or are rational arguments enough? And of course, this is one way to go, and it's one way that academics in general would favor, because this is what we do to make a livelihood also. But of course, there are certain limitations to it, because we know that people respond emotionally to issues and not always rationally. So I don't have a really great idea on how to do it, on how to respond to the emotional aspects of these debates, but I think we have to take that aspects into consideration. In our forthcoming book, The Case for Degrowth, we discuss a lot the idea of the common sense from a Gramscian perspective. So we are trying to take into consideration, the opinions that the common sense we mean, well, you can understand what is common sense for people, So when you say, oh, there are too many peoples on the planet, well, this is, unfortunately, it has become a common sense, with this idea of, oh, there will be an invasion of migrants to Europe and so on. This is not a fact. There is no rational, any rational proofs of this, but it has become something that people believe. So we have to see how we can twist the common senses. And I think with the current crisis, there is a new common sense building, that care is important and should be at the center of society. That, for instance, the privatization of the health system was a mistake or is problematic with the situation that we are facing now. So we have to be sensitive to how those common senses are changing, and we have to try and link our discourse to that. Rationally speaking, the idea of overpopulation, I think it's complete crap. The problem is not the environmental impacts of how many, I don't know, millions of people live with subsistence agriculture. The people is how many people live like myself. That is really the problem in environmental terms. But this, again, it has been a switch. If you look at it historically, in the 70s, with the limits to growth debate, the debate was very radical, and the position on the mainstream debate was that there was too much production and consumption from wealthy nations, and that states should intervene. And the sustainable development turn in the 80s turned this around, on the sense that it built up the argument that those responsible for the environmental crisis are people that are poor because they overexploit the environment, And therefore, if they are poor, the response is economic growth, so that we can increase their income. And that action should not be taken by the state, but it should be done from the local level, like Agenda 21, from the municipalities, and voluntarily from businesses. So you see how the mainstream discourse is always trying to switch these common senses in order to put forward the proposals and the positions that favor the dominant actors in the political scene. So we have to be careful to that.
Thank you. I will try to combine a few questions which more or less go towards the same direction. One is a very recent one. Do you think one country alone could go down a degrowth trajectory, or would it require a global initiative? And I think this connects to what Federico was saying also in terms of strategies. So I think, you know, the ecological crisis, both in terms of the COVID and in terms of the climate crisis, seems to have the need to be solved through rapid, coordinated and transnational efforts. And so there is a common argument that there is a need for a global governance able to enforce measures everywhere in order to be able to rapidly tackle climate change or the pandemic. And however, the Pluriverse is the call for a different thing, and for a bottom-up process of autonomous and democratic local initiatives and movements, which feels like it would take some time to emerge, I imagine. So I think that there is a tension, like in terms of global versus local and quick versus slow. And I know it's a big one, but I think I would like the speakers to explore this tension. And I'll connect it to a couple of more questions, which are very much related anyway, which is, when mobilizing for the degrowth movement, how should we envision this on a large scale? And what are the caveats in the sense of that the message does not get lost? And then there is, do you have strategies to make civil society a more active political participant? How does degrowth can affect the hegemonic politics that only wants to make economic growth? Julia, do you want to go first?
Those are big questions. I think the one country, I think that it's a combination as usual, but I think that we've seen very promising developments, including in the degrowth sphere, or including in spheres that are adjacent. So I know that some people within degrowth were a bit critical of the Green New Deal, but I see it as something that is building on a lot of activism that happens at local levels. The first Green New Deal, or one of its first iterations, was done in the UK 10 years ago, with the Green Party and a bunch of different people there, and it sort of morphed and translated across the world. And then it ended up getting a lot of traction in the US and sort of coming back to Europe, and it's now in Europe in different forms, different countries, different forms. But one of the things we're seeing is that we're seeing a lot of activism and program building that then pushes the agenda through various think tanks, through associations with academia, through whatever, and that tries to influence party platforms or how ambitious policy can be. And I think that we're seeing a lot of coalitions building internationally and paying a lot of attention to each other, which is good. And academia has a role to play in that and making those links happen. And I think that we also see it translating into specific policies in specific countries or specific cities. So we see individual countries, for instance, so there was also a question on New Zealand, Iceland, Scotland, and I forget a few others that are sort of self-styled well-being economies. So there's this idea of the We All Alliance, the Well-being Economy Alliance, and these governments, it's not necessarily that they're all going away from growth or even abandoning fossil fuels in the case of Scotland, but they're at least going somewhere in the direction of saying we want to put well-being at the heart of our economies. And you see them having a very different response to COVID, for instance, even Scotland compared to the UK as a country. So I think it is entirely possible for these smaller bits and pieces of movements who are sort of pushing from below and advancing the agenda and sort of building what that platform would look like, country initiatives And then these sort of and then all of a sudden the debate changes because other countries see this happening and can demand more from their own national governments. So I think that that's something that I hope that that was an element of response. I'm just going to stop talking.
Corinna, you want to?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very interesting question indeed. I mean, what Julia said about the Green New Deal, I think having a radical and degrowthy Green New Deal is definitely an achievement. And more recently, last week, the state of Hawaii has published a pandemic recovery plan of feminist economics, which is a good achievement. However, still, I'm always a bit reluctant with those perspectives of scaling up, because scaling up to me, it starts from state-centered perspectives in a way. And indeed, I think we should have a bottom-linked degrowth approach. It should link to the state. It should link to, if there is a feminist economics recovery plan, fantastic. But we're, as Julia said, we're kind of trying to push for a degrowth transformation from below. And that's why I would suggest that we're not only talking about how to scale up something from the national level to a global level, but really what Federico also said before, to start from the local and to also try to reframe the scaling up strategy to a scaling out strategy, like scaling out in horizontal terms, like in situated replication and polycentric connectedness of social movements, because it also avoids this whole risk of bureaucracy and top-down structures, which are very much inherent in process of always growing bigger and bigger. So more this horizontal with flat hierarchy move, but still I think, as I said, that some things like a radical degrowthy Green New Deal or a feminist economics recovery plan are good starts anyway.
Yeah, these are good questions. So my dog is complaining that he wants to have dinner, but he has to wait. Talking about care, I would say, well, these are good questions. We have been debated 20 years now in the degrowth community about these issues, and political movements have debated about this for centuries, I would say. So what I could suggest is see what we have written, come to the degrowth conferences. There will be one in Vienna soon, but also next year, hopefully in Manchester and in the Netherlands. Come if you want in our master in Barcelona, because these are really the things that we are debating. I can give now some quick reaction. I don't buy the urgency argument. The quick and slow debate, in the sense that we have to be very careful there to say that, oh, it's very urgent, because then if you accept that urgency, then it opens up to things like, oh, it's too urgent for democracy, democracy is low, so let's go for a dictatorship. It quickly goes into that. So I know that the situation is serious. There is a climate emergency, but look, the situation has been serious forever. I mean, the social situation, the gender violence is not an emergency. It has been an emergency for centuries. So yes, it's urgent, and we should be doing as much as we can. But let's be careful with that urgency argument. Then on the issue of local global, well, I was pointing to it already before. For instance, with the Pluriverse, we identified in the Pluriverse book all these local alternatives, if you want. Some of them are national initiatives, but then we end the book with the manifesto with the call for a global convergence of alternatives, and we call it the global tapestry of alternatives. And you can look at it. We are aware that we need some kind of global coordination. What forms this global governance would take, well, I think it's very much open. But yes, of course, it's on the table. And on the issue, one nation, more nations, well, I think, yes, I think that one nation could start implementing some of these policies. Of course, there are problems with it, because if you start to implement degrowth policies, you will have capital flows immediately. But well, there are ways of tackling it. So I don't think it's an impossibility, or we should say, until we don't have the whole European Union, or until we don't have every country in the world, we are not ready to act. No, we are ready to act. We can do things now that can already benefit citizens right now. On civil society, as I said before, within degrowth there are many people involved, and more people have been joining. There have been, for instance, Greenpeace, who have been making statements that were very close to degrowth. So I think degrowth has played a role, if you want, in influencing the debate. We have engaged, for instance, with socialists and with eco-socialists who think that if you have socialism, economic growth would be greener somehow. So I think those are ongoing debates, and with degrowth we have been trying to influence. I think our influence has been increasing. For instance, there are articles in newspaper, in mainstream newspapers like the New York Times or the New Yorker. There was recently an article which we were very surprised by, the Harvard Business Review, which was arguing that businesses should not be scared of degrowth. Of course, there is a risk of watering down the message, and we have to be careful with that. But I think it goes on with the process. And again, I don't see degrowth as the only response, neither worldwide and nor in Europe. I think degrowth has a relevance for debates in the global south also, especially now, for instance, that they're facing a collapse of the economy. But also in Europe, I don't think degrowth is the only answer. I think degrowth is bringing some important aspects, is putting emphasis and the focus on some important aspects of the debate, but we have to ally with other people. For instance, with these initiatives by the DiEM25 on Green New Deal, there was a chapter also which was discussing how the Green New Deal could not be centered around economic growth. And those are the things that we should be doing. Join different mobilizations and try to bring our arguments there, and then build up an alliance.
Thank you. To follow up the discussion on global versus local, there is a question about military power. How do you reconcile the voluntary diminution of hard power embodied in the Western degrowth movement, military material production, in a world order mainly determined by the ratio of power? In other terms, how can you rationally defend a degrowth program in the EU, for instance, in a world where global military spending is rising and power tensions still exist? Julia, would you like to comment on that?
Okay. I'm not a specialist in military resource use or such things like that, because the question often comes up of why are we talking about the civilian economy and not the military economy? I would say that the degrowth perspective, because it's a perspective that really is quite focused on power relations and who benefits from the current system, is actually quite promising in terms of dealing with military tensions as well, because right now the military serves a portion of civilian society. It serves the people who have the power to influence where resource extractivism should happen, which areas need pacifying, and those kinds of issues. So I think that the military aspect is an aspect of state power that is used to enforce violence across the world, and often within society as well, usually at the behest of capital, usually at the behest of the wealthiest sectors in society and specific industries. So I'm American. I don't know why we keep going to war in oil-rich areas. It's a mystery. Who could ever figure it out, you know? So I think that that's one of the things, is that we're talking about de-escalating the danger to all of us, to globally, locally, from an economic system that is centering around wealth accumulation and continual profits by specific sectors and going to specific people. And so I would say a degrowth perspective on the economy de-risks those tensions as well, in terms of what the function that the military is playing very often.
Federico, do you want to comment on this as well?
Yeah. So in our Pluriverse book, one of the chapter is on pacifism, and it's written by an Italian sociologist called Marco De Rio, and he exactly puts emphasis on the fact that pacifist movement should be focusing on the issue from a degrowth perspective, because many of the military conflicts around the world are related to the push for economic growth, extraction of resources, so on and so forth. So I think it should be there. I must say that the degrowth community has not engaged enough with geopolitics. I think if I have to identify, there are many weaknesses, because basically degrowth, because it is an horizon, is trying to engage with all the issues, but of course you cannot do so. You cannot do that so easily. So geopolitics is exactly one of the issues in which we are weakest, I would say. I'm well aware, and I'm not so naive. I don't think it's just, as I said before, it's just an issue of putting forward good rational arguments and then everything will be fine. I think we are facing obstacles. I don't think one of the main obstacles is that people would not like the proposal of degrowth. They might not like the slogan, that doesn't matter. But I think they could be fine with the proposal if we can link them with their common senses. But here the major obstacles are exactly the military-industrial complex and the people who benefit from growth. So I think this is not by chance that there are a number of actors like large corporations and so on and so forth, which benefits from the current system, and therefore they're putting all the efforts that they can in order to keep it going at the cost of everything else. So I think our role there should be explaining how this is taking place. The fact that the focus on economic growth is not benefiting citizens, is not benefiting humankind, but is benefiting certain interests that we have to question. That is going to be a struggle and is not going to be an easy one. And that's why I said we need to be as organized and as mobilized as possible. Again, in our book, The Case for Degrowth, we try to engage a little bit also, if you want, on the political feasibility of our proposals, but I leave you to the book not to take more time. Thanks.
Okay, I think we'll do the last couple of questions and then we'll wrap up. I'd like to pick up a question about cities, because I think it can bring very interesting different perspectives from the speakers here. What is the future of cities in a degrowth world, and can degrowth municipalism beat capitalist urbanization? Yes, I think this is it. Julia, do you want to go first? Or someone else as well?
Karina, do you want to?
Yeah, I can. Well, degrowth municipalism, I think the rate of urbanization in Europe is like roughly 70 to 80%, something like this. I think it's clear that we don't need more and more and more urbanization. However, I also want to emphasize that I think of a degrowth transformation not as a radical rupture, but more like as a transformation process. And as I totally like the idea of degrowth municipalism, but it's I don't know, more ahead, and we need to also think about steps which we can do now for more sustainable lives in cities. And I think that Barcelona actually is a really good example of how institutions of degrowth municipalism and communized care, for example, is already happening within the city. So I think it's not an either or question, like we need both, and we need both in more sustainable manners.
Federico?
So in the Pluriverse book, for instance, there is a chapter on social ecology that comes, you might know, from Murray Bookchin, which puts a lot of emphasis on municipalism, and this is in the tradition of anarchism, if you want. And for instance, this perspective is very strong among the Kurdish movements in Rojava and so on. So if you're interested in this question, I think that could be a good starting point. We have an ongoing project now for a special issue. I pasted the link in the YouTube chat for a special issue on exactly on degrowth and urbanization. We are not saying degrowth and cities because, well, there is a debate within geographies on this, that there is a kind of a fetishism of cities, but there is a larger issue that is urbanization, because cities clearly have impacts much beyond their territories. So we prefer to speak of urbanization. The question we are raising there is how can we build a radical urban degrowth agenda for future cities? There have been already some reflections on this. You can see them cited in that call for papers. We edited a special issue which is called Geographies of Degrowth, in which there is something about cities already. Geographers have been working a lot on these issues, but this, I think, is one of the things we need to work more from a degrowth perspective. It's clear that cities are taking more and more importance, even at the global level, politically speaking. And I think municipally is being a perspective that has been gaining importance, certainly in Spain. For instance, in Catalonia, where I live, Catalonia is the region around Barcelona. There is a small political parties that is environmentalist, feminist, pro-degrowth, and so on, which has about 5% of support. And they're clearly municipally. So for many years, they didn't run national election, and they're still not running European election, but just local municipal elections. So there are many experiences in this direction. I would not say that degrowth per se is just for municipalism, but it's clearly there in the debate, and I think it's increasing and it's growing.
I guess I would just say that I wouldn't pit the two against each other. So I wouldn't say urban growth is bad or urbanization is bad per se, or that there's a certain scale that's the ideal scale. I think one of the things that I'm very glad the environmental movement in general has moved away from is this idea that we all have to go back to the land, that we have to leave cities. Cities are evil, they're the location of sin and pollution. And I think that it's just physically not possible. We are not hunter-gatherers anymore. We can't go back. There's a path dependency to this until population levels do constrain us to certain modes of production, consumption, and living. And I certainly believe that it is a lot easier to be sustainable at a lower population level because mouths to feed equals land. I mean, there's a sufficiency level of consumption that requires certain consumption levels, and this is the way the world is. It doesn't mean that the population level is the main problem, because overconsumption is way worse. But it's still something to think about in terms of what is possible. And I think that within cities, there are calls, for instance, by Paul Chatterton. I can leave that. I think the YouTube chat's not letting us leave links. I tried to leave links, it didn't. But on what COVID-19 can teach us about a new kind of urbanization. And there are these calls for the 20-minute city or the 15-minute city, something where you can live and work and have your provisioning activities within a 15-minute bike ride of where you live, and and cultural activities and so on. So you can have relocalization that's convivial, that includes commons, that's low pollution within a city, even within a mega city probably. And I think that that's something that we have to think about, is how to make the cities very excellent places to live, how to make the remote countryside, remote rural areas excellent places to live within a degrowth context. We don't get to choose how to rebuild the entire world population. We start where we are and we do what we have to do. And it can be very, have excellent modes of living in regardless of location. Probably the hardest place is going to be someplace like an American suburb. That's going to be a lot harder than a downtown area, for instance, but still entirely plausible to do it.
If you'd like to share some links and documents, maybe you can send them to us and then we add them in the description as well. And the last question, sorry that we can't address more questions from the chat. How can we propose ideas of degrowth towards large international companies who have more fiscal resources than some countries, when their concern will be protecting of existing and future capital? Federico, would you like to go first on this?
It was very nice in the through the out talk. I was always the last one, which gives you more time to think about what you want to say. No, being the first one is more tough. I was laughing because I was thinking there is an urban environmental sociologist from the US called Mike Davis, and I think he proposed the nationalization of Amazon. It's a very tough questions. There are more moderate, if you want, proposal like the one of Christian Febler, no, from Austria, of the economy of the common good, which to me sounds more like sustainable development. And he's proposing like how large corporations could become more sustainable and so on. I don't believe that. I don't think it's possible. I think we are questioning the mere existence of those corporations. So if you talk of large businesses, then I don't think they can easily be turned into something that is democratic and environmentally sustainable, so on and so forth. This is easy to say, but difficult to do really much. So states, as the person who raised the question probably was thinking, states have a problem because some of these corporations are very, very large. So questioning and challenging them has become very, very difficult. So this again goes to the obstacles that I was mentioning before. I think we need to build up a broad coalition of movements before we go on into confronting these powerful actors. And there is a long way, and it's not going to be easy for sure, but there are many reasons to keep up the fight.
Julia?
Yes, I think it's really interesting. So I think that first of all, these corporations have to be addressed. In terms of the nationalization, there's that, which is something that's more and more on the agenda, is should you allow a harmful corporation or a corporation that sort of has its own purpose detrimental to your population's interests, be continue to operate. And so one of the things that's very interesting is there's a think tank in the US called the Next System Project, and they have a lot of thinking on how do you do nationalization. So how you take nationalization seriously if there's a corporation or private sector that you need to repurpose, or you need to take it over and ramp it down, because on their own, for instance, the fossil fuel industry doesn't seem to be going gently into that good night, or rather they're taking us with them in a very violent way. So we have to think about how to do that. And maybe now is a really good time because oil prices are really low. A lot of their assets are totally worthless. This might be a really good time to nationalize a lot of the fossil fuel industry and ramp it down in accordance with the Paris Agreement. So I think that these ideas have to be taken seriously. They might sound crazy, but they are really at some level quite sensible. I think the other thing to think about is that these companies are not separate from the rest of the fabric of society. So they have workers, they have customers, they have places they operate where they are physically based. And so for instance, in the case of Amazon, Amazon had this fantastic movement, still has this fantastic movement of workers who organized for climate and who started calling out Amazon on the fact that it was trying to present a green image in some sort of small ways, but at the same time had an entire branch collaborating with the oil and gas industry, just targeting oil and gas industry to get more stuff out of the ground. And these workers really went up against their company and spoke at shareholder meetings and staged walkouts and participated in student strikes. And just 10 days ago or something, I think it was just at the end of last week, just very, very recently, I've lost track of days because of the lockdown. 2 of them were fired. 2 of the most important organizers of the Amazon climate movement, workers' climate movement, were fired by Amazon. Do you know why? Not for their climate activism, but because they stood up for warehouse workers. So warehouse workers in Amazon who are being forced to work in very unsafe conditions. And I thought that that was really interesting, because the thing is, if that link between the tech workers and the warehouse workers is made, that's even more scary to Amazon than thinking about the climate change, because it starts making a coalition across social class, and it starts making unionization possible. So social mobilization within an industry, within a company can happen. And other tech workers looked at what was happening at Amazon, and now there's Google for climate, Microsoft for climate, Apple for climate, all of these different ones are happening. And so I think that that's also something to take seriously, is that we shouldn't necessarily be treating these corporations as a monolith. Maybe the people at the top and the CEOs and so on are very fixed and can't be moved. But the people, there are thousands of people who work for them who care, who actually want a good future and are very capable of thinking about how their industry could change and want their industry to change. So I think that that's also something to take a bit seriously, is that we should never just take something as a monolith. We should always think, okay, how can we think about organizing the workers? How can we think about organizing the consumers, the customers as citizens within the system? And how can we go towards something that's much more of what we would like to see in a degrowth-based economy, which are basically worker and consumer-oriented cooperatives that that work for a public purpose of good. And everybody wants that. Both the consumers want that, and workers want that, because these are basic ideas of economic democracy. So I think pushing forward these ideas of economic democracy and seeing where they land when it comes to these big corporations is really important. And maybe in some cases it has to land on nationalization. And there's cases in sectors where that should absolutely be what we should pursue, I think.
Thank you very much, all. Before closing, I would like to briefly announce the following talks, our next appointments, so the audience can put them on their agendas. So next Wednesday, on the 6th of May at 6 p.m. British Summer Time, the same time as this one, we will have Decolonizing Degrowth, Perspectives from the Majority World, with Mladen Domazet, Miriam Lang, and Brototi Roy. Then on the 20th of May, same time, we'll have Transforming Money for Degrowth with Joe Ament, Louison Cahen-Fourot, Julio Linares, and Mary Mellor. And then on the 27th of May, same time, The Green New Deal and the Political Economy of Degrowth with Stefania Barca, Riccardo Mastini, and Timothée Parric. So we're going to bring forward many of the topics that were touched upon today. I'd love to ask an applause for the three fantastic speakers that joined us today. I'm sure it would be a loud one, but unfortunately, this is one of the things that cannot be done on YouTube live streams. Anyhow, we're deeply thankful for the three speakers that joined us in our first talk. And lastly, I would like to remind everyone that the organizers, the moderators, and the speakers of these talks are carrying on this project on a completely voluntary basis, simply for passion and determination in wanting to change the situation. And well, thank you very much, everyone, and see you next time.